I met Daniel during my medical rotation, and from the very start, I could tell he was different. He wasn't like the other residents I'd met, so often caught up in the chaos and competition of the hospital. Daniel was humble, driven, and kind. He was intelligent, no doubt, but never used that to make others feel small. I admired his work ethic and his ability to connect with patients, making them feel at ease during some of the worst times of their lives. He was already well on his way to becoming a trauma surgeon, and I could see that he was destined for greatness. What struck me most about Daniel was how grounded he seemed despite the relentless demands of residency. But beyond all the long hours at the hospital, I could also see how much he loved his wife, Claire. They had been married for 2 years, and from the way he spoke about her, it was clear how much he adored her. Whenever he talked about their relationship, you could hear the affection in his voice. They seemed like the perfect couple, young, successful, and deeply in love. Claire was always a topic of conversation with Daniel, and he would often tell us stories about how they met, their adventures, and how they'd supported each other through everything. It was apparent that Daniel's life wasn't just about the hospital. His family meant the world to him. But like all of us, he was juggling the pressures of his demanding career with the responsibilities of being a husband. Claire was always understanding of his long hours, and Daniel often talked about how hard he worked to make their relationship thrive despite the challenges. One day, Daniel and I were on shift together, and he seemed more on edge than usual. I couldn't help but notice the bags under his eyes and the exhaustion etched on his face. It wasn't just the physical toll from the shift, it was something else. When we got a rare moment to sit down, he opened up to me in a way I hadn't expected. He told me how much he loved Claire and how they had been planning something special for their 2-year anniversary, which was coming up soon. He had taken a 30-hour call shift that day, but instead of going home to rest, he decided to surprise her. He picked up some of her favorite flowers and a chocolate cake from her favorite bakery. It wasn't just about the gifts, it was the thoughtfulness behind it all. It was his way of showing her how much he cared, despite the chaotic life they lived due to his job. He planned on showing up unannounced to remind her of the day they first met. Hearing him talk about it, I could see how excited he was. He wasn't just a dedicated doctor. He was a man who deeply valued his family and the love he had with Claire. I didn't think much of it at the time, but I could see how important this gesture was for him. It was going to be a special moment in an otherwise routine, demanding life. But the next time I saw Daniel was at 5 a.m. the following morning, and it wasn't the same man I'd spoken to earlier. I had just finished a shift, and I was heading to my car when I saw him sitting in the parking lot outside the hospital. It wasn't the typical end to a long shift. He wasn't walking briskly to get home or to grab a bite to eat. Instead, he was sitting in his car, hunched over, his face in his hands. At first, I thought he was just exhausted, but when I got closer, I realized he was crying. I froze for a moment, unsure of how to react. Seeing Daniel, this man I'd come to respect and admire, the one who was always calm, collected, and composed, break down like this was jarring. It felt wrong, almost surreal. I've never seen him show that level of vulnerability before. There's something about seeing a grown man cry that's gut-wrenching. It doesn't matter who they are. It's one of those things you never forget. I walked up to his car and knocked gently on the window. His face was red, his eyes swollen from tears. I could barely recognize him. I opened the door, and before I could say anything, he looked up at me with a broken expression. I don't know what to do, he said in a voice that barely rose above a whisper. His hands were shaking as he wiped his face. I didn't know what to say. I sat in the passenger seat, trying to make sense of what was happening. Daniel wasn't the kind of person who shared his emotions openly, but there was a rawness in his voice that told me everything I needed to know. After a long silence, he started to explain, his voice cracking as he spoke. He had gone home the night before, flowers and cake in hand, ready to surprise Claire for their anniversary. But when he got there, everything fell apart. He found Claire in bed with another man. His mind couldn't process it at first. He was exhausted, confused, and overwhelmed by the betrayal. His immediate instinct was to leave, so he did. He didn't even confront her. He just walked out of the apartment, left everything behind, and came back to the hospital. He didn't have his phone, didn't have anyone to talk to. He was just sitting there in his car, hoping that the next few hours would somehow make sense of everything. But they didn't. I didn't know how to respond. What do you say to someone who's had their world shattered? How do you console someone when the pain is so raw and deep? All I could do was sit there silently, offering him the only comfort I could give, a shoulder to lean on. But in that moment, it wasn't enough. It wasn't enough to take away the heartbreak, the confusion, or the sense of betrayal that Daniel was feeling. That night, I saw him at his most vulnerable. And in that moment, I realized that no amount of training, no amount of medical knowledge could prepare any of us for something like this. The heartbreak unfolds, a betrayal too deep to understand. The next few hours were a blur for Daniel. As I sat with him in that parking lot, his eyes fixed on the hospital's glowing lights, it became clear to me just how broken he was. The man who had once been the epitome of strength, dedication, and resilience was now reduced to a shell of himself. His heart had been shattered by the one person he thought he could always rely on, his wife, Claire. I had never seen someone so lost, so hopeless. Daniel's tears weren't just a release of pain, they were a reflection of the complete disbelief that had consumed him. He had spent the entire day in the hospital, enduring a grueling 30-hour shift, all with the intention of returning home to his wife with the kind of thoughtful surprise that so few people are capable of. His excitement about their anniversary, about celebrating the day they first met, had been genuine. It was a simple gesture, yet deeply meaningful, a testament to how much he cherished their love and the life they were building together. But that night, his entire world came crashing down in a matter of seconds. It wasn't just the infidelity, it was the complete violation of trust. Daniel wasn't the kind of guy who would jump to conclusions or overreact. But what happened that night was so far removed from the life he thought he was living that it left him paralyzed. He told me that when he walked in, he couldn't process what he was seeing. Claire, his wife, his partner, was in bed with another man. He didn't even recognize him, and the man didn't even seem to acknowledge him at first. It wasn't a fight. It wasn't an angry confrontation. It was just a shocking, heart-wrenching moment that left Daniel completely speechless. I could hear the sadness in his voice as he recounted what happened next. He told me that he didn't even think. He just walked out of the apartment, leaving the flowers and cake untouched on the kitchen counter. The woman he had trusted, the woman he had worked tirelessly for, had betrayed him in the worst possible way. And yet, in that moment, all Daniel could do was leave. The weight of it all was too much. He didn't have the energy to confront her. He didn't have the will to hear her excuses or justifications. His mind was in chaos, his body exhausted from the emotional toll. The hospital, his place of work, was the only place that felt familiar, even if it meant sitting in his car at 5 a.m. trying to make sense of what had just happened. I watched him try to process the situation, and I could see the struggle on his face. His thoughts were fragmented, but it was clear that his mind was racing. He couldn't understand why Claire would do something like this. He couldn't comprehend how, after everything they had been through, after the long shifts, the sacrifices, the plans for their future, she could betray him so completely. The more he talked, the more I realized just how deeply this betrayal cut. This wasn't just a question of infidelity. It was the emotional weight of it all. Daniel had given his heart to Claire in a way that only someone truly committed to building a future would. He wasn't just working for a career. He was working to give them a life together. But it wasn't just the work that mattered to him. It was their connection, their shared dreams. He had thought they were partners in everything, until that moment when his whole world flipped upside down. "I don't even know what to feel," Daniel said quietly, staring out the windshield. His words hung in the air like an unspoken question. "I don't know how to process this. How could she do this to me?" There was no answer I could give him. How do you explain to someone that the person they've built their life around has just destroyed it? How do you comfort a man who had given everything he had to a relationship that now felt like a lie? There were no easy words, no quick fix. I could only sit with him in the silence, knowing that the healing process for him would be long and painful. The rest of the morning was a blur of phone calls. I had called his father, and within the hour, Daniel's dad showed up to take him home. The family support system was what Daniel needed in that moment. He needed someone who could help him navigate through the mess that his life had become. As his father took him away, I knew that Daniel would need time. Time away from the hospital, time away from the chaos, to heal. I later learned that this wasn't the first time Claire had been unfaithful. That fact cut through Daniel like a knife, but it also explained the confusion and the emotional devastation he was experiencing. How do you rebuild trust after it's been broken more than once? How do you move forward when the foundation of your relationship has been built on lies? I felt a deep sense of loss for Daniel that day, not just for the pain he was enduring, but for the man he could have been had things turned out differently. He had so much potential, and in that moment, it felt like his future was uncertain. But despite everything, I knew one thing for sure: Daniel would find his way. He was an incredible person, an incredible doctor, and no amount of betrayal would erase that. Still, I couldn't help but feel that he deserved so much more than the hand life had dealt him. In the days that followed, Daniel took a leave of absence from his residency. He needed to step back, to regroup, to process. And while I had no doubt he would return to his passion for medicine, I also knew that the road ahead for him would be long and filled with emotional healing. The trauma of betrayal was something no one could be prepared for, no matter how strong they were. But as I watched him walk away that morning, I couldn't help but hope that, despite the heartbreak, Daniel would find the strength to rebuild his life. He was destined for greatness, both as a physician and as a person, and no matter what happened next, he would rise again. The following days were a blur for Daniel. I couldn't begin to understand what he was going through, but I could see the weight of it pressing down on him. His world, once so clear and focused, had been turned upside down. He was a resident, dedicated to his training. But now he found himself struggling with something far more difficult than any medical challenge he had ever faced. How do you focus on saving lives when your own life feels like it's falling apart? Daniel had always been the kind of guy who prided himself on being level-headed, someone who could handle whatever life threw at him. But this was different. He wasn't prepared for the betrayal. No one is. How do you prepare yourself for the reality that the person you trusted most, the one you thought you'd spend your life with, has betrayed you? The emotional toll it took on him was evident. After he left the hospital that night, still in shock, it wasn't just about the pain of seeing Claire with another man, it was the emotional devastation that followed. It was about the trust that had been broken, the years of love and commitment that suddenly felt meaningless. I could see how much it was eating at him, how the pain lingered in his eyes, even when he tried to put on a brave face. For the first time in a long time, Daniel felt powerless. He was used to being in control, to managing his responsibilities with precision, but this was something beyond his control. He couldn't fix this with knowledge, skills, or determination. There were no shortcuts, no procedures, no solutions that could heal this kind of wound. His world was falling apart, and he didn't know where to start putting the pieces back together. I continued to check in on him over the next few days. At first, he didn't want to talk much. He kept saying he needed time to think, to process everything. But it wasn't just about thinking. It was about survival. How to survive a betrayal that cuts so deep you can't even recognize yourself anymore. I remember one afternoon, a few days after the incident, when I saw Daniel again. He looked different, like he had aged years in just a few days. His eyes were hollow, his body slumped, and the exhaustion was more than physical. It was as if the weight of his emotions had drained the life out of him. He had taken time off from residency, but that didn't mean the pain stopped. We sat in a quiet cafe not far from the hospital. Daniel sipped his coffee absently, staring out the window, not really seeing anything. He looked lost. I didn't push him to talk right away. I knew he needed space, but I also knew he couldn't stay in that headspace forever. When he finally spoke, his voice was raw, thick with emotion. I keep thinking about the first time I met Claire, how I felt so sure about her, about us. We were a team, man. Everything I did for us. I thought she was my partner, you know? And now I don't even recognize the woman I married. His words hit me hard. I could hear the disbelief, the confusion in his voice. He had built his life around this relationship, around this idea of love and partnership, and now It all seemed like a lie. How could someone who had shared so much with you, someone who had promised to stand by you, turn their back on everything you thought you had? How do you reconcile that? I don't even know where to start, Daniel continued, his hands gripping the coffee cup tightly. How do I go back to who I was before all of this? I can't unsee what I saw. I can't forget the look on her face when she saw me standing there, when she knew everything was about to change. How do you come back from that? I didn't have the answers. I couldn't give him the easy fixes that he was searching for, because there weren't any. What happened to him wasn't something that could be fixed overnight, or with a simple conversation. The emotional damage had been done, and it was going to take time to heal, if it ever did. All I could do was listen. I knew that was what Daniel needed most right then, to be heard, to have someone there, even if I didn't have the answers he was looking for. I told him the truth, that it would take time, that it wouldn't be easy, but it would get better. Eventually. I didn't know if that was something he could believe in, but I knew it was the only thing I could offer him in that moment. The truth was, we were all human. We all had our breaking points, and Daniel was at his. His world had been turned upside down by a betrayal so deep it felt impossible to recover from. But I knew Daniel. He was strong. He would get through this. It wasn't going to be a quick recovery. He wasn't going to wake up the next day feeling better, and there was no guarantee that things would go back to normal. But I knew Daniel had the heart and the strength to rebuild his life, even if it seemed impossible right now. For now, I just let him talk. Let him process everything at his own pace. I hoped that in time he would find his way back. And that when he did, he'd realize that despite the betrayal, he was still the same person, someone capable of amazing things, with a future that was far from over. As the days turned into weeks, the numbness that had settled over Daniel began to give way to a raw kind of pain. The emotional toll of what had happened wasn't something he could just shrug off. At first, I thought maybe the distance would help him heal. He had taken time off from his residency after all, and I figured some time away from the hospital and the chaos would give him a chance to breathe, to gather himself. But the more I saw him, the more I realized that the wounds ran deeper than just the initial shock of what had happened. Daniel had always been someone who prided himself on control. In medicine, control is everything. Controlling the chaos of an emergency room, controlling a patient's treatment plan, controlling the environment so that you can make decisions with confidence. But here, in his personal life, there was no controlling the heartbreak. He couldn't fix it with medical knowledge, couldn't apply a procedure to make it go away. He was forced to deal with it in the rawest way possible. I would check in on him, mostly out of concern, but I also knew that he wasn't ready to talk through everything just yet. He was struggling to accept the reality of his situation. The anger and confusion from the first few days had started to settle into something more painful, a feeling of complete betrayal. As much as Daniel tried to put on a brave face, I could see the cracks in his armor. It wasn't just the infidelity anymore. It was everything that had come with it, the broken promises, the lies, the things left unsaid. One day, I called him to check in, and he sounded different. His voice wasn't as tight with emotion, but there was a coldness to it. He seemed detached. After everything he had been through, I knew he was beginning to face a deeper, more difficult truth. This wasn't just a one-time mistake. This was the reality of his marriage, a marriage that had been built on more than just love. It was built on trust, and that trust had been shattered. I could hear it in his voice when he said, "I found out it wasn't just one time." The words hung in the air between us, heavy with meaning. For all the shock and devastation Daniel had felt that night, this was the part that truly broke him. It wasn't the isolated incident of betrayal that stung the most. It was the realization that Claire's actions weren't a one-off. It had been happening for longer than he had known, and that knowledge cut deeper than the initial shock. "What do you mean?" I asked quietly, already knowing the answer but not sure if I was ready to hear it. "I found messages, texts, emails. It's been going on for months," he explained, his voice flat. I didn't want to believe it at first. I wanted to think it was a one-time mistake, something I could work through. But it wasn't. It was a pattern. And now, I can't trust anything anymore. The silence that followed his words felt like a wall between us. I could feel the weight of his words, and I knew this was a turning point for him. No longer could he hold on to the idea of rebuilding his marriage or making sense of his wife's actions. He had seen the truth, and it was worse than he had imagined. The lies, the deceit, it was all there in black and white. Claire had crossed a line that Daniel would never be able to unsee. He wasn't sure what to do next. Who could blame him? His entire foundation had been ripped from under him. The life he had spent so long building with Claire, the relationship he thought was solid, had turned out to be a house of cards, one that collapsed with a single gust of wind. His trust in her was gone, and with it, his sense of self. How could he move forward when everything he had known was now a lie? "I don't know what to do," Daniel said, his voice cracking with exhaustion. "I don't know if I can go back to her. I don't know if I even want to." I could hear the anguish in his voice, and I knew that he was at a crossroads. He had come to the painful realization that he couldn't move past what had happened. The past few weeks had been him trying to reconcile the man he thought he was with the reality of the situation he now faced. He had been living a lie, and the truth was something he was struggling to process. His trust in Claire, his belief in their love had been shattered. And now he was left with the overwhelming task of figuring out how to rebuild his life, if he could even rebuild it. That evening, I went to visit him. When I saw him sitting in the same spot where I had found him days ago, I could see the toll this had taken on him. He was thinner, more withdrawn. His eyes looked tired, distant. I sat down beside him, offering no words at first. There was nothing more I could say. He turned to me after a long pause. "I can't go back to that. I can't pretend like everything's fine when it's not." I nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. It wasn't about saving his marriage anymore. It wasn't even about Claire. It was about Daniel finding himself again. This betrayal had shaken him to his core, and he needed to come to terms with it on his own terms. It would take time, probably more time than he was willing to admit, but it was clear that the road to healing wouldn't be easy. "I just need to get out of here," he finally said, his voice soft. "I need to step away, take some time off. I don't know who I am anymore." And I knew that for now, stepping away was the only thing he could do. He needed space, time, and the chance to find his way again, no longer defined by the person who had betrayed him, but by the man he had always been, a compassionate, hard-working, and deeply good person who deserved better. Days turned into weeks, and Daniel's struggle with the aftermath of Claire's betrayal continued to haunt him. The emotional roller coaster he'd been riding, the anger, the confusion, the crushing heartbreak, had left him feeling like he was walking through life in a fog. He had taken some time off from residency, but as the weeks wore on, I could see that the decision to step away from work wasn't just about taking a break. It was about giving himself the space to breathe, to heal, and to figure out what came next. We met up a few times, but each encounter felt different. Daniel seemed quieter, more introspective, and at times I could tell he was struggling with the simple act of moving forward. His mind, which was usually so sharp and focused, was clouded by the weight of his personal life. Every conversation we had felt like a step in a direction he wasn't ready for. Yet it was the only path he could take. One afternoon, after we'd grabbed coffee, Daniel opened up a little more. The words didn't come easily, but he was starting to find a way to talk about his pain. He told me that despite all the devastation, there were moments where he wondered if he could have done things differently. He wondered if he had missed signs, if he had somehow failed in his marriage. It was clear that his mind was filled with self-doubt, questioning his worth and his decisions. I keep thinking, maybe if I'd been there more, maybe if I'd paid more attention, maybe it wouldn't have happened, he confessed quietly, his eyes downcast. Maybe it's my fault. I could see the guilt gnawing at him, the emotional scars still fresh, but I knew better than to let him spiral into a pit of self-blame. I reached across the table and placed a hand on his. "Daniel, this isn't your fault," I said firmly. "You're not responsible for Claire's choices. No matter how much you care about someone, you can't control their actions. You did everything you could for her, and this wasn't something you could have fixed." He nodded, though I could see that part of him wasn't fully convinced. He wasn't ready to forgive himself yet. But I knew that it would take time, and that was something he would need to learn on his own. Healing from betrayal wasn't something that could happen overnight. Over the following weeks, Daniel took baby steps toward rebuilding his life. He spent more time with his family, his parents, his siblings, people who loved him and who had always been there for him. It was in their support that I saw the beginning of his recovery. As much as he had leaned on Claire, as much as he had poured himself into his marriage, he had been neglecting other parts of himself, the parts that didn't depend on her. He also slowly began to return to his passion for medicine, though he hadn't fully returned to his residency yet. But I saw him start to immerse himself in books, attending smaller medical conferences, doing what he did best, focusing on his work. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a step forward. It was a way for him to reconnect with his identity as a physician and remember the purpose that had driven him before. There was still so much pain beneath the surface, but Daniel was learning to manage it. He was finding a new rhythm, even if it meant taking things day by day. I watched as he slowly started to smile again, even if it was faint at first. There were moments when he would talk about what happened, but there were also moments when he would let himself laugh, enjoy small victories, and rediscover joy in the things he once loved. One day, he told me something that I knew was a turning point. "I've been thinking a lot about what comes next," he said, looking out the window as we walked through the hospital parking lot. "I can't go back to the life I had with Claire, but I also don't want to live in the past forever. I'm still figuring it out, but I think I can make it through this. I think I can be better for it." I could see it in his eyes then, the strength returning piece by piece. It wasn't the same strength he had before, but it was a new kind of resilience, one that came from within. Daniel was learning to accept that life had handed him a brutal blow, but he wasn't going to let it define him. He was determined to rebuild, not just his career, but his sense of self. Over time, Daniel returned to his residency. It wasn't an easy transition, but he was slowly reintegrating into the role he had once been so passionate about. The work was demanding, as always, but it seemed to ground him. Each shift, each patient he helped, was a reminder of why he'd chosen this path. He was rebuilding his life from the ground up, and while the road wasn't easy, he was walking it with more confidence. What I had seen in Daniel months earlier was a man who had been broken beyond recognition, but what I saw now was someone who had started to heal, who had found a way to rise from the wreckage of his marriage and rebuild himself. The road to recovery wasn't linear, and there were days when he still struggled. But he had come a long way, and in the end, I knew that Daniel would be just fine. He was destined for greatness in medicine, but more importantly, he was finding his own strength again. He wasn't the same man he had been before all of this, but in many ways, the man he was becoming was someone even stronger, someone who had been through the fire and had survived.